There is a claim you've probably heard so many times it feels like settled fact. Men think about sex every 7 seconds. If that were true, a man would have approximately 57,000 sexual thoughts per day. That would leave almost no time for anything else, including the job, the conversation, and the driving. The real number, from one of the most rigorous studies ever conducted on this question, is 19 times per day. Women in the same study averaged about 10 times per day. That's a real difference, roughly twice as often, but it's a far cry from the myth. And the actual science behind why that gap exists is considerably more interesting and more controversial than the number itself. Let's start with what is not in dispute. Across dozens of studies, across multiple decades, across different cultures and methodologies, men on average report higher frequency of sexual thoughts, higher desired frequency of sex, higher interest in casual sex with unfamiliar partners, and a stronger response to visual sexual stimuli than women do on average. These are consistent findings. They are also averages across enormous populations, which means they describe tendencies, not individuals. The variation within each gender is enormous, more than the variation between genders. But the average difference is real, and evolutionary psychology has a specific explanation for why. The explanation begins about 200,000 years ago, with a fundamental asymmetry in the biology of reproduction. A woman can produce roughly 400 eggs in her lifetime. She can carry one pregnancy at a time. Each pregnancy costs her 9 months, enormous energy expenditure, significant physical risk, and, in the ancestral environment, years of intensive nursing and care afterward. Her maximum possible number of offspring over a lifetime is somewhere around 15 to 20, and even achieving that would require near-constant pregnancy from puberty to menopause. A man produces approximately 525 billion sperm in his lifetime. The biological cost of a single act of reproduction for him is negligible. His maximum possible number of offspring is theoretically in the thousands. The record, among historical rulers with large harems, runs into the hundreds. This is the asymmetry that evolutionary psychologists argue produced a difference in the psychology of desire. Natural selection does not care about what you want. It cares about what produces more offspring. In an ancestral environment, a man who thought about sex more, pursued more partners, and consented to sex more readily would, on average, over many generations, leave more descendants than a man who didn't. The genes associated with high sexual motivation in men were passed down more consistently. A woman, by contrast, faced a completely different optimization problem. With a much higher biological cost per offspring, she had far more to lose from any single sexual encounter. She could not afford to be undiscriminating. Her genes were better served by selectivity, waiting for a partner who showed signals of genetic quality, resource provision, and commitment. This is Robert Trivers's parental investment theory, first published in 1972, and it remains one of the most influential frameworks in evolutionary biology. The parent who invests more in offspring, biologically, tends to be the more selective one. The parent who invests less tends to compete more aggressively for access to the high-investing parent. In humans, women are the higher-investing parent by a dramatic margin. The theory predicts they will be more selective. The data consistently shows they are. But here is where it gets genuinely complicated, and where the pop science version of this story usually goes wrong. The difference in sexual thought frequency is real, but not nearly as large as cultural mythology suggests. The Ohio State study that produced the 19 versus 10 figure also found something equally interesting. Men thought about food and sleep more frequently than women did too. This suggests the gap isn't specifically about sex. Men appear to have higher awareness of bodily states in general, a finding that complicates the clean evolutionary narrative. Second, the gap between men and women in sexual desire narrows dramatically under specific conditions. When women are in relationships, they rate as secure and satisfying. Their reported desire increases substantially. When social stigma around female sexuality is experimentally removed, when women are told their responses are completely private and anonymous, their reported interest in casual sex rises significantly, narrowing the gap with men. This suggests that some portion of the measured difference reflects social conditioning and fear of judgment, not purely biological baseline. Third, testosterone is the key hormone linking evolutionary history to present-day psychology, and it doesn't operate the way most people assume. Men have on average 10 to 20 times the testosterone levels of women, and testosterone is the primary driver of spontaneous sexual desire in both sexes. Women with higher testosterone levels report higher spontaneous desire. Men who lose testosterone through age or medical treatment report dramatic drops in sexual interest. The hormonal mechanism is real, but testosterone levels vary enormously between individuals, and the average difference between genders is not destiny for any specific person. Fourth, and this is the finding that generates the most controversy, women's sexual desire appears to be more context-dependent and more responsive to social environment than men's. Roy Baumeister's landmark review of the literature described this as women having greater erotic plasticity. Their sexual desire is more shaped by culture, relationship context, and circumstance than men's tends to be. In some cultural contexts, the gender gap in sexual frequency of thought essentially disappears. In others, it is larger. This variability itself is informative. It suggests the biology sets a range, and culture determines where within that range any given population ends up. None of this is without controversy. Feminist scholars have argued with some justification that many of these studies were conducted in Western, educated, industrialized contexts that may not reflect universal human psychology. They've pointed out that findings about female desire are heavily influenced by cultural environments that have historically stigmatized female sexuality, making it difficult to separate biological baseline from social suppression. These are legitimate critiques. The evolutionary psychology response is that the patterns appear cross-culturally across dozens of studies, including non-Western populations. But the debate is ongoing, and the data are genuinely complex. Here is what the most careful reading of the evidence actually supports. Men, on average, experience more frequent spontaneous sexual thoughts than women on average. This difference is real, measurable, and consistent across studies. It is plausibly explained by evolutionary asymmetries in reproductive investment that shaped different psychological baselines over hundreds of thousands of years. It is amplified by testosterone differences and possibly by social factors that suppress measured female desire. It is not a rule about individuals. It is not a justification for any behavior. And it is smaller and more variable than popular culture has ever suggested. The every 7 seconds myth was never true. What is true is more interesting. 2 different reproductive strategies shaped over deep evolutionary time, producing 2 slightly different psychologies, both human, both variable, both more similar than different, and both far more complicated than any simple story about men and women ever manages to capture. The gap is real, the explanation is complicated, and anyone who tells you the science settles this question cleanly is not reading the same science.